studios that...
It's not a good game, it's a good story. I think there's a direct difference between a good game and good story. I think truly what people really want are interactive, in-depth gameplay systems, but really we want an interactive movie. AAA movies. Last video for the day, and it's from Bellular.
Welcome back to the news, everyone, where this week we're starting off with a fairly bloody major story, and it essentially is Square Enix getting rid of their biggest Western studios. Yeah, they've been acquired by the Embracer Group. Pretty massive. So what's happened is that Embracer Group are buying Crystal Dynamics, Eidos Montreal, and Square Enix Montreal.
Okay, so it's
pretty big acquisition.
More depth than the last video we watched.
Is $300 million, which, compared to a lot of the other acquisitions we've seen in gaming recently, really is not that much money at all. And even in comparison to some of Embracer's own acquisitions lately, it's also not that much money, which is kind of surprising. Now, this does include a lot of IP. As an example, there are things like Tomb Raider. We've got Deus Ex, which maybe there could be a bit more.
Dude, thank God Deus Ex got out of that. Honestly, Deus Ex needs to get, like, a new game, and I think this is great for Deus Ex itself.
Hope for that. Thief, of course, and also Legacy of Kain, as well as over 50 back catalog games.
Dude, could you imagine a Legacy of Kain remake?
Which very much, almost certainly means Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, the likes of that. So they're getting continued sales of all of those games, which basically just implies absolutely everything has been acquired. That's 1,100 employees across 3 studios, all the IP, all of the in-development games, all of the games are actively running, like Marvel's Avengers, as an example, and it is a pure cash deal, $300 million upfront. That's it, done! Square Enix is out of the West.
Damn.
Pretty major. I mean, Square Enix in the West has been weird. We all know the headlines of a big Square Enix game comes out like Tomb Raider and it's called a disappointment. The likes of Marvel's Avengers, which ends up being underwhelming. Also,
I mean, Marvel's Avenger was a completely flop. I mean, honestly, like, it's one of the worst games I've ever seen.
Being a bit of a disappointment. The Guardians of the Galaxy game, which was an excellent game, but also was considered a disappointment in terms of the sales. Now, before we get into some more of the money involved here, and the rather shocking profitability of the studios that...
It's not a good game, it's a good story. I think there's a direct difference between a good game and a good story. Guardians of the Galaxy was not a good game. It was a good story.
Being acquired. I think we need to talk about Embracer. So... it must have been over a year ago whenever we first really started focusing on Embracer in our coverage, and what we've basically seen is them gobbling up a hell of a lot in terms of companies. Every few months they seem to go on another acquisition spree. Last year they actually raised almost $1 billion, and that was for acquisitions. Now the most high profile one that they own would probably be Gearbox Entertainment. So yeah, Embracer, they own Borderlands. Also THQ Nordic, Koch Media, Coffee Stain, a lot of big games from Coffee Stain, Saber Interactive, and then also some smaller publishers. Ever heard of Dark Horse, the comics people? Well, Dark Horse are in fact owned by Embracer Group now. So after this deal closes, Embracer Group is going to have, I mean, this is staggering, everyone.
It's crazy because the last several years, the monopolization of like companies like this has been going crazy. Like companies getting a monopoly on like several different big studios, like has been a state. It's like Disney, but like going crazy in the video game world. There's like, I don't know. There's like the acquisition of Microsoft acquiring Activision and Blizzard is another moment of like the monopoly is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and this is another example of that in the West.
4 studios and 14,000 employees. 14,000. Compare that to the other big companies that we always think about, like Electronic Arts, Activision Blizzard, Ubisoft. And you see that while Embracer Group is almost never talked about, it is right up there with the big boys in terms of just sheer scale. They've got an insane amount of small to medium IP as well. To give you some highlights here, Koch Media, right? That means Saints Row, Red Faction, Shadow Warrior, Dead Island, Metro, Payday.
It's a lot of good games.
Well, there's Beamdog. Beamdog is a new studio that is formed by old BioWare devs. Then Asper Media. They did a bunch of like KOTOR remaster work, and also I think they're making new KOTOR stuff as well. It's wild. Of course, THQ Nordic, Painkiller, Biomutant, Darksiders, also for Coffee Stain. I mean, you've got the obvious with Goat Simulator, but also Deep Rock Galactic, which is it's a brilliant game that has performed extremely well. And that's the thing that you really come to appreciate with Embracer Group. They're not really there for those big games that sell 10 million copies or whatever. They seem to more be about having a large quantity of games in their portfolio that do reasonably well. It's almost the opposite of, say, the Activision strategy of going extremely deep into one franchise.
It's like having 1,000 B movies instead of 100 A's, pretty much.
And maximally monetizing it. So it's quite interesting. Now, there's some key things from their press release that I think are interesting, worth being talked about. They're saying there are not enough resources available in the industry to meet demand. And if you look at the troubles of, say, even companies like Activision Blizzard, the troubles they're having in staffing up. I always go back to the example of Activision Blizzard being happy enough to let Bungie go because Bungie was taking up resources of support studios like High Noon, or High Moon, whatever, who were, of course, from their perspective, better deployed in Call of Duty, right? They're saying that every developer that they've acquired or could just find to contract, that they're fully utilized across all territories. They say they're buying up AAA studios because there's an increasingly strong demand for high-quality content, including AAA single-player games over the last decade. Now, that is an interesting one. If you look at the companies that have been acquired here, the AAA single-player games is exactly that. Less so for Marvel's Avengers, but of course, Guardians of the Galaxy, Deus Ex, Tomb Raider.
Story games.
And I wonder then, these are games that obviously were not performing well enough for Square Enix to be happy, but for Embracer, does this actually fit into their strategy just fine?
I think truly what people really want are interactive, in-depth gameplay systems, but really we want an interactive movie. AAA movies. Give us. Like, we want a game that plays well, but we also want to be entertained by a good story.
Fine. Now, to talk about a diversified portfolio, I think ultimately numbers help, and they have over 230 games in the pipeline. That's an insane quantity of games, and more than 30 of those are games that you could call AAA. Of course, whenever they acquire these new studios, that means the games that they're currently working on. So as much as they've had a few duds lately, it could be that Embracer is seeing potentially some great upside in the in-development games that they've acquired along with these studios. There's also some interesting things going on with Embracer. They have a whole games archival thing going on, right? The full team categorizing old games and also hardware. They say that their mission is to have a copy of every physical game ever released. Which
that's kind of cool.
I suppose certainly is cool and is really something they wouldn't have to do, because you can't really see that being a goldmine. Now, will these studios be treated well?
No.
That's the big question. I mean, when we think about Square Enix in the West, there's so much. I always remember Super Bunny Hop's reporting about Square Enix really wanting to push with the live services, and even some of what that did to the Hitman franchise. Of course, Deus Ex, Human Revolution, a game that initially was scoped to be quite a bit larger than it was. If you've ever wondered why the ending of, or not Human Revolution, Mankind Divided, if you've ever wondered why the ending of that just felt like really quick, and the game, it's like a great game, but it doesn't feel like a complete game or the complete story, a lot of that could come back to some Square Enix meddling and some crazy things they were doing with their business model.
God, that game could have been so good.
And when you think about Embracer, what's interesting is they just continually seem to release mid-sized games and pretty competent remasters. All right, we've had Destroy All Humans, Kingdoms of Amalur, Darksiders, SpongeBob, Baldur's Gate. And then when it comes to how studios are being ran, apparently also quite good. So there's an indie, right? It's called 34 Big Things. Now, they were under Saber Interactive. And there's basically just some... I won't go into it fully. The key upshot is that Embracer don't seem to meddle massively with their studios. Now, you could always have the counterpoint with Saber Interactive. Of course, they own Zen Studios, and we recently talked about Zen, you know, the iffy things that was going on with Zen Pinball in like the latest version on the Epic Store and just all of that stuff. But overall, Embracer don't seem to have been raising red flags, things that would make you be very worried about maybe the state of the games they're releasing, interference with the developers, and that should basically mean that it should be okay. I mean, for another good example, take Biomutant. Now, unfortunately, that game, as much as it looked really cool in demos and stuff, it didn't come out great.
It's a bad game.
But what's interesting is that THQ Nordic let that game stay in development for way longer than intended, because THQ let them set their own deadlines, the developers, you know, so they wouldn't be crunched, so they wouldn't be burnt out. While Biomutant is not a perfect game, it definitely has its issues. Skill Up's review, I think, is worth checking out for that game. Imagine how much worse it could have been. Because from everything I understand...
How much worse it could have been, but also, like... I don't know, like, if crunches are actually too entirely that bad. Because some people... I'll be honest, some people do not work well unless they have a deadline. They don't. Some people just, they work inconsistently. So I only speak from experience of myself, because I know that I work inconsistently without a deadline. Without setting a deadline for myself, I struggle. I think having hard crunches where, like, people just, like, die is bad. But being like, hey, within the next 6 years, like, make sure you get this done, is not a really bad way to... Like, the way EA went about not Bioshock. What is the name of the game? Anthem. The way EA went about Anthem was pretty good. Like, from everything I've read, from everything I heard about, they gave them so many extensions. And they did not force them to go crazy. Like, the only time they were, like, finally, like, doing crunches was like, hey, guys, it's been, like, 6 years. Can we please get our game that we paid you guys for, like, and gave you extra ample time? Like, those are the only times where it's like, well, I mean, yeah, of course there's a crunch going to happen. But I think crunches happening is bad if it's too quick. Like, people who pump out a Assassin's Creed title every 2 years. Like, that's not good, right?
Understand, it did not really feel like one of those bizarre AAA releases that's clearly like 2 quarters early and is full of bugs and is just a big mess. So I think that's also a pretty good sign for Embracer. Ultimately, they seem to just believe that the games industry is on the up and they want exposure to as much of that as they can.
It's going to crash,
and they
dude.
probably know that game developers are the people.
The game industry is going to crash eventually. People are going to keep getting abused. Jurisdictions, government is not taking care of managing gambling in games or how microtransactions go about in games. And eventually, the gaming market's going to crash and come back up again. I 100% believe that's going to happen.
Best for doing game development, not them. It's quite interesting. Now, what this could mean for Square Enix is fascinating, because 300 million is not a lot of money, but we got to think about things. So apparently, the 2 Avengers games ended up costing in and around 200 million over like around 2 years. I saw that be reported.
They had to buy rights.
And that's quite a shocking number. I mean, we at least know that the Marvel's Avengers game, the big live service, was a really big hit on their financial performance. So what this means for them is they have 300 million cash. So that's pretty awesome. Also, that's 1,100 employees they don't have to pay. That is a massive back catalog of games they don't need to think about anymore. So not only do they get a cash injection, but also this will be quite nice for their cash flow.
True.
And in terms of what they are giving up in terms of profits, it's not that much when you compare it to the amount of investment that would have to go into these studios. Right? Just their burn rate was massive. Here's a tweet from Daniel Ahmed. For reference, Crystal Dynamics had a profit margin of 3.6% in 2021. That is not great compared to Square Enix as a whole, with a 14.2% profit margin. It's even worse for Eidos Montreal, though, who had a profit margin of 0.65%. So ultimately, in terms of
It's
money,
like you're gaining pennies.
these companies are not really going to be missed. Yeah, it will mean less revenue for Square Enix, but with a profit margin like that, I mean, the lost revenue, also the lost expenses, and you get this cash injection that you get to redeploy onto other projects. I think you can see how, even though it's not a massive quantity of money, why it could actually make a lot of sense for Square Enix to do this. An interesting situation. So, overall, what does Square Enix want to do? Well, that is where Matsuda, I think, is getting himself in, and his company, in quite a bit of hot water. Maybe we'll have another situation where Naoki Ishida, the game director of Final Fantasy XIV, will have to again reiterate the FF14 team's stance on like blockchain and crypto integration, which from him was a firm no. But, well, here's their full thing. The transaction will assist the company in adapting to changes underway in the global business environment by establishing more efficient allocation of resources. Okay, efficient allocation of resources. Think about the amount of money they had to pump into these studios for very small margin. Wouldn't make sense. Which will enhance corporate value by accelerating growth in the company's core businesses in the digital entertainment domain. So if you're a 14.2% operating margin, and that is, mostly driven by the things you are doing in Japan, obviously you're going to be more efficient. You're going to have more cash, more of your cash flow will be freed up to go into these things that they believe will be driving more of their future growth. Because evidently, continuing...
It's not just the deadline is forced overtime. Yeah, I know. I'm saying like, crunching, I think I already explained, but crunching depends on like what the situation is. It's all dependent on what's going on. It's not as simple as don't crunch your workers ever. I think that's just dumb because like sometimes people take advantage of that. It's just the truth. I think that crunching all the time though is really bad, and like forcing it, like I said, within every 2 years having an Assassin's Creed game, it's pretty bad.
On this Western path hasn't really been working. Now, the transaction, they also say, enables the launch of new businesses by moving forward with investments in fields including blockchain, AI, and the cloud. Now, AI and the cloud makes sense. Blockchain, per the market, does make sense. Just some of this shit's what the market wants to hear, everyone. Now, of course, play to earn, things like that. They've talked about it. I think we all know what play to earn would do to our video games in terms of the incentives. I mean, hey, if you feel a bit iffy about grinds, you do not want play to earn to get into your game, because that will create all sorts of messed up incentives. It's worrying stuff.
Becomes a job.
Now, the weird thing with Square Enix is they have had some absolute hits, absolute bangers like FF14, which I believe is the most profitable game in the history of that franchise, which is an incredible achievement. But they have had a lot of hits and misses.
Like this
game.
Chocobo
GP, we covered that in a video that actually did pretty well, so you probably did see that. Chocobo GP, which, I mean, should have been a free win, but it was aggressively monetized to a pretty ridiculous degree. Triangle Strategy, well, that was fantastic. It was well received, over 1 million copies sold, which is pretty damn impressive considering the genre. Then, of course, we've got Babylon's Fall. Remember Babylon's Fall? Tell you what, I'm going to do this live right now. And there you go, 69 people were playing it 19 minutes ago. 24-hour peak for the big new live service action game from Platinum, creators of Bayonetta. And of course, Nier Automata, one of the, some people would say one of the best games ever made. So to have a 77 24-hour peak, I mean, man, that is pretty damn brutal. So it was a massive flop. You've got Stranger of Paradise. Actually, it's an excellent game and brilliant for the fans of the franchise, but it sold low in Japan. Which was surprising to me, and we actually don't know Western numbers.
Combat's good,
now,
story's
that
terrible.
is a bad sign, because with Triangle Strategy, it came out, I think, 2 weeks before Stranger of Paradise. And we do know its numbers. So generally, if the numbers aren't shared with us, it means they're not exactly numbers that they would want to share. So basically, they can do well. They're trying to push live service in mobile. They're struggling with some of that working. They have had some mobile hits, and of course, FF14 has been incredible for them. In the West, though, it's been a lot of investment for not a great deal of return. I think they're basically just through with trying to get that experiment to work, and I think they therefore have just decided to get rid of that asset, get a cash injection,
Yep.
and invest into whatever they think is going to be the next big thing.
Makes
I
sense.
think that's essentially the situation. Ultimately, though, I will say this, right? When I think about the likes of Deus Ex, I mean, Human Revolution is one of my favorite games. Maybe just hit at the right time, but man, I love that game. And apparently the story is that Square Enix still did think, they thought the likes of Deus Ex and Thief were important, but they just focused on the likes of Avengers and Guardians. My big hope here is that with Embracer Group seemingly really having a respect for established IP that people like,
Fuck was that?
and perhaps seeing that these Marvel games have struggled a bit, and perhaps also
Really Angry
with these
Hedgehog, thank you for the
studios having
15
a little
bits.
bit more control of
Holy
their own
shit, that
destiny
scared me.
with this new owner, as seems to be the case, judging by their other studios. It does make me think that maybe there could be some hope for, well, me and my fellow Deus Ex fans, which would be a really nice thing. So ultimately, I think this is a good move for people who play video games. Square Enix, I think, were not doing the best job at managing these studios. I'm sure there's blame on both sides there, of course. But it obviously
we're
was a
almost at the end.
situation that
That's
wasn't working out ideally. Now, those studios maybe have got a bit more control of their own destiny. And I think that could ultimately be quite good for us. Because when you look at Embracer Group, they just seem to get it. Now, that's not me saying that they perfectly know video games. But at least they seem to know that they're there as the big structure to provide fun.
Good try though. Yeah, we're watching a
provide
video. We're doing
resources
we
and
always
just
do
to support
reactions
that
in the
kind
very
of thing,
beginning of the
but
stream.
They don't seem to go in and mess around with the game development. Especially that Biomutant story, that they were willing to foot that extra bill for a longer period of development. I mean, that sounds pretty good to me. And in a world
sucks,
where
dude.
they have
Biomutant had a lot of
230
potential,
games
man.
from
Game's is trash,
124
though.
studios, maybe it is okay to delay something by 6 months or 9 months or even a year. It's a bit harder for Blizzard to do that.
You feel provoked?
When they have a far smaller quantity of titles.
I'm sorry, man. Wasn't intentional.
So, I think this could be a hopeful one. Do let me know what you think, though. And, I mean, man, do you want to see the Mankind Divided story be continued?
Yes.
What do you want? Do you want more Adam
Please.
Jensen? Do you want something new?
Yes.
In Deus Ex, to be honest?
Yes, I want more Adam
again,
Jensen
but
in my life. Holy shit. Video was by Bellular News.
Tanya, the law.
Bend the West.
Roger, it's me. Don't push it.
Oh my god.
Don't push it. I'll give you a war you won't believe.
Give me a war. Give me a war. I'll fight you. I'll fight you in the street. I can take a hedgehog on. No problem. No problem. Easy. Easy clap. All right, guys. We're going to transition over to Final Fantasy XIV. We'll be back in a few minutes. Really Angry Hedgehog, thank you for stopping by. I really do appreciate the bits, man. I know they're not a lot, but I appreciate it. We will be right back.
You have no